He looked like just another quiet rancher. Weathered hands, sun-leathered face, boots worn smooth from years of honest work. Silas Ward was the kind of man who didn't waste words. He spoke when it mattered, and when he spoke, people listened. He built his ranch from the ground up with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn resolve. Every nail, every beam, every inch of land bore the weight of his values. Hard work, fairness, and never asking a soul about where they'd been. As long as they showed up ready to do the job. The house stood at the mouth of the valley like it had grown from the rock and soil itself. Strong, steady, silent, just like Silas. 3 months ago, a young woman arrived at his doorstep. Her name was Mercy Whitmore. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a flicker of desperation in her eyes that a man like Silas couldn't ignore. She was maybe 20, though the weight in her gaze made her look older. Worn out, haunted, she asked for work. He needed help keeping the house. No questions were asked. No answers were given. Mercy kept to herself. She cooked, cleaned, did her duties without complaint or conversation. Silas respected that. In his experience, the people who spoke the least often had the most to say when the time finally came. But that morning, something shifted. He had just come in from checking the cattle, boots thudding across the wooden porch, when he caught a glimpse of her through the kitchen window. And what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. Mercy was limping. Her right leg dragged slightly behind her, stiff and reluctant, and every few steps, she paused, gripping the edge of a chair, a countertop, anything within reach. Her face was tight with pain, but it was the kind of pain she clearly didn't want anyone to see. Silas watched from outside, eyes narrowing. He'd noticed little things before, how she sometimes favored one side, how she'd wince, just for a second, when she thought no one was looking. But this was worse. The way she moved reminded him of an old mare he once had. Fell in the ravine one winter, came up bruised and shaken, but still tried to trot like nothing was wrong. It was the kind of pain you didn't cry out about. You buried it. You pushed through it. But Silas had seen enough. He opened the door. The hinges creaked like they always did. A familiar sound in a house that never had much need for words. Mercy straightened up instantly, her back stiffening like a soldier caught off guard. But it was too late. He had already seen. Her face went pale. And for a fleeting second, in those tired young eyes, Silas caught something that made his chest tighten. Fear. Not of him, but fear still. She turned back toward the stove, stirring a pot of coffee like her life depended on it, hands moving a little too carefully, too precise. "Morning, Mr. Ward," she said, the false cheer in her voice cracking like old wood. "Coffee's almost ready." It was the voice of something broken pretending to still be whole. Silas didn't answer right away. He hung his hat by the door, eyes fixed on her trembling hands as she reached for 2 coffee cups. They rattled just a little, not enough to spill, just enough to betray her. The kitchen smelled like fresh beans and ashwood and something else, the sharp tang of a lie. Mercy wiped the counter obsessively, over and over. It was already clean. Silas watched. This wasn't housekeeping. It was a retreat. She was trying to disappear without leaving the room. "Mercy," he said finally. She froze. Her hand stopped mid-wipe. "Yes, sir." "You're hurt." He said it plain. No judgment, no pity, just truth. And truth, Silas Ward had learned, had a way of hanging in the air like thunder that hadn't struck yet. Outside, a meadowlark called in the distance. Inside, the only sound was the clock ticking above the mantel and the barely there stutter of Mercy's breath. She turned around slowly, and what Silas saw made his jaw clench. Her bottom lip was split, just slightly, a fresh cut that hadn't fully scabbed. A fading bruise, yellow and ugly, stretched across her left cheekbone, hidden beneath strands of hair she'd pulled forward. But it was her eyes that screamed. Eyes that had stopped believing better days were coming. "I fell," she said too quickly. "Stupid of me. Slipped on the stairs yesterday." Silas placed his coffee cup down gently. "There are no stairs in your cabin." Mercy blinked, opened her mouth. closed it again. They both knew. Her cabin sat just behind the main house, one single level, built flat against the land with only a step leading to the door. Silas had built it himself. Every inch. She was lying. The lie hovered between them like smoke from wet wood, bitter, choking, impossible to ignore. Her hands twisted in her apron. For a moment Silas hoped, she might tell him the truth. But no. She lifted her chin, and for the first time he saw something beneath the fear. Defiance. "I should get back to work," she said. She turned away again, moving toward the pantry with careful, measured steps. Steps that knew pain. Steps that remembered it. This wasn't the first time. And that's when Silas made his choice. Whatever was happening to Mercy Whitmore, whoever was doing this, he was going to find out. And when he did, they'd learn the hard way what happened when you harmed someone under the roof of Silas Ward. Because for a man who barely spoke, he'd spent a lifetime proving something far louder. You do not touch what is his. The afternoon sun hung low over the valley, casting long shadows across the dry earth. Silas Ward stood beneath the eaves of his barn, hands resting on a broken harness he had no intention of fixing. His eyes weren't on the leather in front of him. They were locked on the narrow trail that snaked its way from town toward the edge of his land. He wasn't sure what he expected to see, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. And his gut had never lied to him. Then he saw it. Dust rising from the path, a lone rider approaching slow and steady. Even from a distance, Silas recognized the slouch in the saddle, the cocky sway of the shoulders. Deputy Vernon Briggs. The man rode like he owned the dirt beneath his horse's hooves. His badge gleamed in the dying light, not as a symbol of justice, but as a warning. Silas's jaw tightened. He'd never liked Briggs. The man had eyes that looked through people instead of at them. Eyes that calculated, cornered. The kind of man who smiled when he twisted the knife, figuratively or otherwise. And now he was heading straight for Mercy's cabin. The deputy dismounted casually, tying his horse to the post outside the little house Silas had built with his own hands. This wasn't an official visit. There was no air of protocol, no pretense of duty. Briggs looked around twice, scanning the landscape like a man checking for witnesses. Then he knocked. Hard. Silas flinched. The sound echoed across the pasture like a gunshot. The door opened almost instantly. She had been waiting. From his place in the shadows of the barn, Silas couldn't hear a word, but he didn't need to. Body language told him everything. Mercy opened the door. Briggs didn't say a thing. He just walked in, like he owned the place, like she owed him something, and she stepped back. Not just physically. Her whole being recoiled. Then the door closed behind them, and the silence was worse than any sound. Silas's hands curled into fists. Every part of him screamed to storm that cabin, drag the bastard out by the collar, and show him what happened when you crossed the line on a good man's land. But he didn't move. Not yet. Maybe it was the wisdom of age. Maybe it was knowing that fury without facts would only bring down more trouble on Mercy. Briggs was still a deputy, still had the weight of a badge behind him, even if that badge was rotten. So Silas waited. The minutes crawled by like wounded animals. The sky turned amber, then gold, then a shade of blood orange that made the world look like it was on fire. And still he waited. When the door finally opened again, Briggs stepped out first. He adjusted his belt with the smug confidence of a man who thought himself untouchable. His whistle cut through the air, a sharp and tuneless sound that made Silas's skin crawl. Mercy stood in the doorway behind him, barely upright. Her hand gripped the frame like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her hair was pulled low over her cheek again, but even from a distance Silas could tell. She was in worse shape than she'd been that morning. Briggs mounted up and rode off without looking back, a dust trail rising in his wake like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mercy didn't move. She stood there, just watching the dust. Then she turned, slowly, and disappeared inside. The door clicked shut. Silas remained by the barn long after the sun dipped below the ridge. The land turned to shadow. The air cooled. And still, he stood there because something inside him had shifted. The signs were no longer whispers. They were screaming. Mercy wasn't clumsy. She hadn't fallen. This was deliberate, repeated, cruel. And now he knew who was behind it. Briggs. The deputy. The law. Or at least the twisted version of it that strutted around with a badge and a god complex. That night, Silas lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The shadows from the oil lamp danced across the wooden beams like ghosts with unfinished business. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. He kept hearing that knock. Seeing Mercy's eyes. Watching her limp from one end of the kitchen to the other like each step cost her a piece of her soul. By the time dawn crept over the valley, Silas had made his decision. It was time to speak. And if the sheriff's office shook because of it, so be it. The next morning came with a gray sky hanging low over the valley like a worn-out wool blanket. Mist clung to the grass, and the wind smelled of earth and judgment. Silas hadn't slept. He'd spent the night staring at the ceiling while the shadows from the oil lamp danced like ghosts above him. Echoes of things that couldn't be said, only felt. By the time dawn broke over the ridgeline, his decision was made. It was time for the truth. He found her in the kitchen, just like every morning. Only today she moved slower, too slow. Every step was measured, cautious, like walking through a minefield of pain. She didn't look at him when he came in, just poured the coffee. Silent, like nothing had happened. But everything had. Silas sat at the table and watched her as she set the cup in front of him. He noticed how she'd pulled her hair forward more than usual, trying to hide something. She always tried to hide things. But now he could see the faint bruises on her neck. Fresh, ugly, real. And something inside him turned cold. "Mercy," he said softly, but firm like the edge of a blade. "I need to ask you something. And I need the truth." Her hand trembled halfway to the coffee pot. She froze. Didn't speak. Didn't move. Silas leaned forward. "Deputy Briggs. He's been coming around here, hasn't he?" The glass clink of the coffee pot hitting the table was louder than thunder. She didn't meet his eyes. I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I saw him," Silas said. "I saw him come to your cabin yesterday. And I saw the way you looked when he left." Mercy's composure cracked. Not all at once. It started in her shoulders. A slight shake. Then her breath hitched. When she finally looked at him, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You don't understand," she said, voice trembling. "He's a deputy. Who's going to believe me over him? Who's going to care what happens to someone like me?" Silas said nothing, because deep down he knew she was right. That was the damn truth. Mercy's voice turned into a whisper. "He said if I told anyone, he'd make me disappear. Said there were places in these mountains where no one would ever find me." Her lips trembled. "He said he's done it before." Silas didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He just sat there and let the weight of it all crush his chest. He had known Vernon Briggs was no good. But this was evil. And it had been happening under his roof. "How long?" he asked quietly. Mercy looked down at the table. "Since I came here. Since the day I stepped into town. He saw me behind the general store. Cornered me. Told me I was his now, whether I liked it or not." "Why didn't you leave?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Mercy let out a bitter laugh, short and sharp. "Go where?" she asked. "With what money? Who'd hire me?" Everyone thought I was under his protection. The word tasted like poison in her mouth. "You were the only one who gave me work. The only one who even looked me in the eye." Silas stood slowly. His hands were flat on the table, knuckles white. When he spoke, it was with the kind of quiet that could make a man listen over a storm. "He's not going to hurt you anymore." Mercy's eyes widened in panic. "Mr. Ward, no. Please. He'll kill you. Or worse, he'll get the sheriff to lock you up on some made-up charge. You don't know men like him. They protect each other." Silas turned toward the door, stopped with one hand on the frame, then looked back at her, and something in his eyes made her fall silent. "There's something you should know about me, Mercy," he said. "I've never been much for talking, but I've always been real good at getting the right thing done. And with that, he stepped outside, leaving the warmth of the kitchen behind. Mercy stood there, breath caught in her chest, her hands clutching the edge of the table. In her eyes now was something different, still fear, but also hope. The morning air was cold and sharp as glass. Silas saddled his horse with steady hands and started down the trail toward town. It would take him an hour to get there, an hour to let his anger settle into purpose, an hour to decide exactly how this would end. The sun rose behind him, casting his long shadow forward as if the land itself was pushing him toward justice. He didn't know how this would play out, didn't care. He wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time, because sometimes silence is safe, and sometimes it's cowardice. And Silas Ward had been quiet long enough. The ride into town was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of the prairie wind. Just the sound of hooves pressing into dry earth and the occasional creak of leather straps under Silas Ward's saddle. Every step his horse took brought him closer to the truth, and closer to war. The town of Dovetail always looked smaller than it felt. Just a few dirt roads, a livery stable, a saloon, a bank that had been robbed twice last year, and the sheriff's office that was never open before noon, unless it was trouble they were causing. Silas rode slow down Main Street. Men tipped their hats, women looked away, and kids went quiet when he passed. They felt it too. Something was coming. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office. The horse snorted. The door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, dust hung in the air like secrets no one dared speak. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the desk. A pair of boots rested on top of it, heels crossed. Behind them, Sheriff Cole McKinney leaned back in his chair, hat over his eyes, pretending to nap. Silas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sheriff moved one boot, then the other, lifted his hat slowly, revealing two tired eyes that had seen too much, and ignored even more. "Ward," Cole said, voice gravelly. "Didn't expect to see you in town this early." Silas didn't sit. He didn't take off his hat. "I'm not here for coffee, Cole." The sheriff sighed, leaned forward, and poured himself a shot of whatever was in that bottle. "Then let's not waste each other's time. What's this about?" Silas took a slow step forward, his eyes sharp, his jaw like iron. "It's about your deputy." The room got colder. Cole didn't drink the shot, just stared at it for a moment, then set the glass down. "You sure you want to open that door?" he asked. "You can't close it once you do." Silas's voice didn't rise, didn't tremble. "It's already open." Cole leaned back, rubbed his chin. "You got proof. I've got bruises on a girl who ain't never lied to me. I've got silence that's louder than a scream. And I've got a man's instinct, Cole. And that's more than you've ever used." The sheriff looked at him long and hard, then stood. "You know how things work around here, Silas. You know how he works. Vernon's not some petty thief. He's the kind of man who gets things done, keeps the peace in his own way." Silas didn't blink. "He keeps the peace by breaking people, by keeping the real trouble away," Cole snapped back. Silas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level only men who've killed in silence can reach. "That girl was trouble to nobody, and he broke her, bit by bit. Don't you dare call that peace." A long pause. Sheriff Cole walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "You don't get it, Ward. I've been here 20 years. I've buried good men who thought justice could ride in like a hero and fix the dirt in this town. All they got for it was pine boxes." Silas turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You buried them because no one stood with them." Cole said nothing, and Silas walked out. Outside, the town had started to breathe again, but not for long, because Vernon Briggs was already coming down the street. Boots polished, badge glinting, gun slung low on his hip like a threat you didn't need to say out loud. He spotted Silas instantly. His smirk came on slow, like whiskey hitting the gut. "Well, hell," Briggs drawled. "If it ain't the quiet rancher come to play cowboy." Silas didn't move. "You and I need to talk." Briggs grinned wider. "Ain't nothing to talk about. You stick to your cows. I'll stick to the law." "You ain't the law," Silas said flatly. You're a disease that wears a badge. The grin vanished. Briggs took a step forward, eyes narrowing. You better be careful with them words, Ward. Men have gone missing for less. Silas didn't flinch. You won't be making anyone disappear anymore. Briggs laughed. Not loud, just cold. You got no proof. You got no case. And you sure as hell got no backup. That's when the door behind Silas opened. Mercy stepped out. Her hair was tied back, her dress plain, but her spine straight, her eyes clear, and for the first time since she came to Dovetail, she looked like someone who refused to hide. I saw everything, she said loudly, and I'm not afraid anymore. The street went dead silent. Even the wind held its breath. Briggs turned, eyes wide with disbelief. You little. But before he could finish, the sheriff stepped out of his office. His hat low, his face unreadable, but his badge was pinned straight. Enough, Cole said. This town's been quiet too long for all the wrong reasons. Briggs stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You serious? The sheriff walked past Silas, past Mercy, and stopped in front of Briggs. Turn in your badge. Briggs stepped back. You gonna believe them over me? Cole looked at Silas, at Mercy, at the street full of people who'd quietly stepped out of shops, porches, saloons, finally watching. I ain't believing anyone, Cole said. I'm just choosing not to be a coward anymore. Briggs reached for his gun. He never made it. Silas was faster. The shot echoed through town like a thunderclap. Briggs hit the ground, his pistol still in the holster. No one spoke. No one moved. And then someone clapped. Then another. And then the whole street echoed with it. Not for the violence, but for the silence that had finally been broken. For the truth that had finally been heard. For the justice that, just this once, had arrived on time. The dust hadn't fully settled. It clung to the windowsills and curled in the sunlight. It drifted in through half-cracked doors and hung over the town like a thin veil of disbelief. A man had been shot. A lawman, no less. And not just any lawman, Vernon Briggs. The very fist that had kept Dovetail in check for years. And now that fist lay buried in the ground. Silas Ward stood beside the grave but said nothing. He hadn't come for words. He didn't believe in them much these days. Cole McKinney, the sheriff who once looked the other way, lowered the hat from his head, let the sun hit the bare truth of his face. He cleared his throat, but no eulogy came. Just a quiet sentence carried like a confession. You protect a man long enough, you end up protecting the worst part of yourself. No one responded. They didn't have to. The silence was honest. Later that afternoon, Mercy swept the porch outside Silas's ranch house. She didn't limp anymore, not because the bruises had healed, but because she refused to let them own her stride. Silas came up the steps with a tin of coffee and 2 mugs. He didn't say much, he never did. Just handed her a cup, then sat down on the top step like he always had. They sat in silence, sipping, watching the horizon stretch out like a promise they weren't sure they believed in yet. Mercy finally spoke. They're saying the town might bring in a new deputy. Someone from the south, maybe. Someone clean. Silas nodded once. Town could use something clean. She looked at him, studying his weather-worn face, the streak of gray in his beard, the scars he didn't bother hiding. You ever think about leaving? Silas squinted into the sun. I did. Once. Years back. Why didn't you? He glanced sideways, just a flicker of a grin tugging at his jaw. Land remembers who stayed when it needed them. Mercy didn't ask what that meant. She understood more than most. A week passed. Then another. Dovetail didn't change overnight. No town ever does. But it got quieter for the right reasons this time. Kids played again in the dusty alleyways. The saloon piano started playing songs that didn't end in fights. And folks who once muttered behind closed doors now spoke their names out loud in the daylight. They said thank you when Silas passed, but he never responded. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because he didn't want to be seen as a hero. He hadn't done it for glory. He'd done it because no one else had. And that kind of man never needs applause. One evening, the mayor came to the ranch. A portly man with sweaty palms and a voice like rusted fence wire. "Silas," he said, "we'd like you to wear the badge." Silas didn't answer right away. He took the offered tin star in his hand, looked at it like it was something heavy enough to break a man's spine. "I ain't no lawman," he said. The mayor fidgeted. "That's why you're the only one we trust." Silas handed the star back. "I already did what needed doing. If your town needs protecting, you'd best protect each other." The mayor left, hat in hand, and Silas stayed a free man. On the edge of town, Sheriff Cole put down his final bottle of whiskey. He hadn't touched it since the day Vernon fell. Instead, he'd taken to writing. Not for anyone else, just for himself. The first line in his journal read, "The cost of silence is paid in bruises." And on the next page, "Let the law bend once, and it learns how to kneel." He wrote until his hand hurt. Then he stood, walked to the porch, and lit a cigar in the dying light. He didn't know if redemption was real, but he was sure of one thing: justice didn't wear a badge. It rode in quietly and left just as silent. Mercy started teaching kids in the back room of the church. She taught letters and numbers, but also stories. Stories about choosing kindness when it's easier to look away. About how strength isn't in fists or fear, but in the courage to stand when it matters. She never spoke Briggs's name. She didn't have to. Every child she taught knew the lesson wasn't in the words. It was in her standing there. Tall, unbroken, alive. Silas, meanwhile, kept ranching. The fences still needed mending. The cattle still needed guiding. Life didn't pause just because a man had drawn his gun for the right reasons. But something was different. He no longer felt alone in his silence. The land still whispered at dawn, and the stars still blinked above him at night. But now they weren't echoing a man who'd swallowed his voice. They were listening to a man who had finally used it. One night, he stood on the porch, Mercy beside him. The wind carried a warm breeze. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. "Town feels different," she said. Silas nodded. "So do I." She turned to him. "You ever think maybe you were always the sheriff this place needed?" He chuckled once, just once. "Nah, I'm just the rancher who finally said enough. To be continued, or not. Sometimes stories don't need sequels. Sometimes all they need is an ending that meant something. And sometimes, in the West, that's the loudest justice of all."